Hi, my name's Maurice Coates and I'm the owner of SEMA Limited, makers of, amongst other things, the SEMA milk pump controller and the SEMA water pump controller. I'm very pleased and proud today to be sitting here and demonstrating to you my 100% made in New Zealand float level probe. As far as I know, and please, I'm more than willing to be proved wrong, but as far as I know, I'm the only manufacturer of these in the Southern Hemisphere. And also this one has a unique feature that nobody else has got, which I'll demonstrate a bit later, and as far as I know, it's a world first. This, as some of you will recognise, is the Spanish-made float level probe that I've been using up till now. Very good unit, nothing wrong with it. It's 316 stainless steel throughout, as is the New Zealand made float, I hasten to add. But there's always room for improvement, and whenever I saw a deficiency in this, I tried to rectify that deficiency in the New Zealand made float. So, some of the key improvements I've made are these. The Spanish float already has quite good sized lock rings on it, and it's got reasonably good sized grub screws, certainly better than some of the ones my opposition uses. But you've still got to use a reasonably small Allen key, not a microscopic one as you have to use in some of my opposition's product, but it's still getting down there and it's quite fiddly, especially if you get a tight grub screw. Anybody that's had to take one off will know what I mean. I've massively oversized those collars. If you look at those, as such things go, they're huge. And there are 6mm grub screws in there. So if you do get a stubborn grub screw, you're dealing with a man-size Allen key, and you can get some decent pressure on it to free up that grub screw. The reason I can do that is I'm using tube with 1.5mm thick sidewalls, so you can put a lot of pressure on those grub screws without any fear of damaging the tube. I was led to believe the Spanish one also has 6mm thick, 1.5mm thick sidewalls, but comparing the weight of the Spanish float against my float, I really do suspect the Spanish one might be closer to 1mm. Could be wrong. If I'm wrong, I apologise to the Spanish, but I do know for absolute certain that the walls of my one are 1.5mm thick. Now, the other mild aggravation with the Spanish-made float is that for some reason a lot of people seem to move this top collar. Now, there's absolutely no reason to move it. You never have to move that. There is only one correct position for it, and that's where it should stay. But nevertheless, a lot of people seem to move it. I don't really know why, but they do. Now, once they move it, it's a problem on these Spanish-made floats because there's nothing to show you where the correct position is, and I end up having to tell people over the phone to measure so many millimetres up from the bottom one in order to establish where that should go. To get around that, on my float there's a groove. You won't be able to pick it up on video, but there is a shallow groove just above where that top collar should be, so you can always get it back in the right place. The bottom collar, really simple. It goes flush with the bottom of the tube. Yeah, that's all there is to it really. There's a little bit of leeway, a millimetre or so either way, doesn't really make any difference, but it is reasonably critical. Now, the other aggravation with the Spanish-made float, and I may add with the John Brooks and the De Lavelle float as well, is there's only one correct way for this float to be put on the shaft, and on the Spanish float that I use there's a laser mark on the side of it right here which indicates where the top is. On the John Brooks and De La Val units there's a dimple on the top of the float. I puzzled over this. The reason that there is only one correct way is because they offset the magnet. The magnet's actually here in these units. Now, for many years I puzzled as to why they would put the magnet into the float anywhere but in the centre. If you put it in the centre, it doesn't matter which way up the float goes. Well, in the early development stages, when I was developing the electronics that go into the middle of the tube, I found the reason why they have to do that, and it's a complex reason to do with the way that the electronics work, and I won't bother you with what the reason is. But quite by chance, once again, I stumbled upon a way of fixing that issue with the electronics. So my float has the magnet in the centre and there is no up or down. Put it on any way you like, it makes absolutely no difference. You'll also notice the float's quite light. Has the same size magnet in it as this float, and it floats just as high in the milk as this float does, but it's lighter, and that means when it's slamming up and down during wash it's got much less inertia and it's much less likely to knock these collars off. But quite honestly, these collars are so oversized that I can't imagine anything knocking them off anyway. And that's pretty much all of the design features of the float. One, I suppose you'd call it quirk, is the Spanish-made float is 12 millimeters in diameter. You can only buy half-inch tube in New Zealand, so the New Zealand-made float is half an inch or 12.7 millimeters in diameter. If you're ever trying to fit one of my floats into either one of my Spanish-made glands or into a De La Val or John Brooks gland, it won't fit because it's 0.7 of a millimetre too big. So I apologise for that. You can get round it by running a 13mm drill down through the gland if you want to, or better yet, buy one of my new made in New Zealand glands. Once again, 316 stainless right through. Similar to the Spanish gland, but there have been a myriad of small design changes, once again to get around little deficiencies that have been found over time in this product. The rubberware is all nitrile. If you hold it next to the Spanish gland, and the Spanish gland is fine, don't get me wrong, it's a nice piece of work, but the New Zealand gland, the machining on it is just of a far higher standard than the Spanish gland, which is pleasing to know that we can still do things very well in this country. And that pretty much one more thing. The Spanish float level probe, as well as the John Brooks float level probe and the De La Val float level probe, have 5 wires. 3 of them are the analog signal, 2 of them are a switch wire, which is activated when the float is at the bottom. My controller only requires the analog speed signal, the analog 3 wires. It works out itself where to stop based on the level of the analog signal. So in the Spanish floats I just don't use the 2 switch wires. In the New Zealand floats that I'm making, I'm going to have 2 options. A 3-wire option, which is all that you need to connect to one of my controllers, but which will not work with a John Brooks or De La Val controller, and a 5-wire option, which is basically exactly the same as the Spanish float and the same as the John Brooks and De La Val floats. So when you're ordering a float, just make sure to specify whether you want a 3-wire float or a 5-wire float. I will have standard sizes on the shelf, of course, in quite big quantities, so there's no fear of running out of stock. And of course the advantage of manufacturing in New Zealand is that it's very easy for me to restock at any time. The standard sizes, of course, are 410mm, 500 and 585mm. But if you want, because I am manufacturing these myself, and I'm manufacturing them in-house, incidentally, in case I forgot to mention that, you can order custom float lengths. Now, I think the pipe only comes up to 6 metres in length, so I guess if you wanted longer than 6 metres I'd have to get a couple of bits of pipe welded together, but nevertheless, any length you want basically. From 250mm would be about the shortest I could do, up to whatever you like. So for those, because I've got to get a lathe set up to do the job, you probably don't want to get custom floats made in quantities of less than 10, but the option is there nevertheless. In the future I will be making a variety of different float level probes. I'll be making just a straight on-off float level probe. I'll also be making ones that have got multiple steps. I think Waikato use a float level probe like that. And basically just a whole variety of different combinations. So I'll be introducing those as they're developed. Only other change I'd like to point out is the labelling. I hope this shows up on video, if not the description will have to suffice. See my logo at the top, float level probe, and then the length, whether it's 3-wire or 5-wire, and whether it's with or without a gland, and of course the most important thing on the labelling, proudly made in New Zealand. I do intend to get more and more and more of my product made here, and to make as much of it in-house as I possibly can. So as that happens, I'll be making more of these videos and introducing the product to you. Thanks very much for listening, and if you want any more details, please email me, phone me, text me, mail me. Any way you want to contact me is fine. Thanks very much. Bye.